My father, Larry Raygor, was a career soldier in the United States Army who was blessed with the gift of storytelling. When he retired, among other things, he became a cancer survivor and lost his voice. So he became a writer and put his stories to paper. This is one that is true. D-Day as I Lived It, written by Larry Raygor. One day in May 1944, a long trail of British buses circled into our compound at Quarm. The 505th Parachute Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division filed aboard, many believing it was just another training jump. Past the familiar pastures we rode, alongside the Sherwood Mortar Range, to the airfield at Nottingham. A strange anxiety flooded our veins. Everyone had the gut feeling of uncertainty. We knew this was going to be the invasion. As usual, the airfield seemed like a prison behind barbed wire. Miles and miles of wire, twisted, curled, and zigzagged. This time, military policemen stood in squads at the gates. Beyond, the airplanes waited in long rows on both sides of the hard stands and even along the runways. On the cul-de-sacs, the aircraft circled like huge striped beetles, for their wings and bellies had been painted with zebra-like white and black bands. They never had stripes before. This alone told us the invasion was imminent. 2.5-ton trucks crawled up and down the pavement, stopping at each plane to discharge cargoes. We would fill the canvas packs with small parachutes attached with the mines they carefully distributed. Then, with the webbing, we would secure them to the underside of the C-47s. Our buses stopped at the end of the hangar, where tall stacks of cots greeted us. In the back of the building, a movie was being projected onto a hanging sheet. The magnified voices of Bergman and Bogart blared indistinctly, mixed with the acrid odor of ammunition cartridges and mothball vapors from the mountain of new blankets. "Not that again, not Casablanca," one sergeant complained. "We saw that 8 times on the way here from Salerno." If he didn't spend time gambling, he would see it many more times, since the movie ran continuously during the week. Meanwhile, we received our issue of impregnated clothing to protect visible, unprotected areas from poison gas, and stinky ointment to protect all the other areas. Ammunition bandoliers, grenades, and huge first aid packets that contained bandages and morphine. We were warned not to open them unless wounded and in imminent danger of death. We were issued a Griswold container to carry our disassembled M1 rifle. The bag would attach to our parachute harness, keeping our weapon close at hand without filling our hands. We attended meetings over a massive, freshly assembled rubber map. We were not told exactly where the jump zone was until the last minute. We ran through our assembly procedures and observed the Pathfinder's lights. The art and mystery of a successful parachute drop lies in the ability of the Pathfinders to assemble troops quickly. Unfortunately, a lot of us never saw their lights illuminated in France. During the third showing of Casablanca, we were told that because of the great number of paratroopers involved, on the initial stages of the invasion, we were not to fire our rifles. Instead, we received vital instructions on the use of the new gammon grenade, an explosive we would carry and throw at the enemy when needed. This grenade was like a dirty sock stuffed with a fist-sized lump of plastic explosive capped with a small shot glass. "Unscrew the cap. This bent piece of metal will unwind the ribbon and release a steel ball. Any sudden change in direction will detonate the explosives. They can't throw it back," the sergeant from Salerno shouted above the voice of the guy on the screen. "Be careful how you handle it. It is dangerous." We were given French francs and blankets. I watched the dice game for a while, but mostly I lay on my cot and thought of home and prayed a lot. I was lonely, and I could see loneliness in everyone's eyes. Maybe a little fear, too. There had to have been fear. Being keyed up for so long, we became understandably jittery when told that the invasion had to be pushed back one day. I think there was a certain anger within the ranks, but aimed at whom, I did not know. A great storm was splashing the Cherbourg Peninsula, and now we knew that Normandy was to be our drop zone. We were to fly south. After the planes made a right turn, we were to stand up and wait for the light to turn green. We would parachute into plowed fields near St. Mary-Glisse. A crock of compost, the sergeant from Salerno said. And he was right. Those plowed fields would be riddled with barbed wire and anti-glider posts, but I'm getting ahead of myself. About midnight, we marched to the plains. There was great apprehension, but everyone wanted to get it over with. The troops did not act like they did at the train jumps, where they would gaze at the low clouds and cry out loudly, "Send her down, JC, send her down." Their communications with JC were now more intimate. The chaplain said that he had never seen so many Christians. Combat Catholics was the way he put it. "How can we get to France by going south and west?" I asked. But no one answered. "I hope it clears up," the chaplain said, and even he smeared burnt cork on his face. In the waiting plane, we sat like modern sculptures. Our reserve chutes pressed against our chin straps. The Griswold containers acted like body splints. Our packs were full and heavy. Gas mask straps sliced into our skin, and the bandoliers of 30 caliber ammunition hung heavy around our necks. Unlike me with my communications gear, those who didn't carry equipment had fixed to their harnesses anti-tank mines. The sergeant held a cage of pigeons in his arm. Our parachute webbing was buckled tightly, and it kept us from even shuffling in our seats. Just sit there and hope our bladders hold, we thought. On our right boot was strapped a jump knife, and around our left ankle, under our trousers, we concealed D-bars of chocolate, held in place by small rubber objects we had been issued for disease prevention. Every pocket was crammed with something. Even the nets on our helmets had the large first aid packets tied to them. Along with the pigeons, the Salerno sergeant was packing a detective novel and a box of King Edward cigars, fresh from the States. When the engines of the planes finally cranked, a chill ran through our blood. Our quiet supplications came in earnest. We were stuffed like 2 feet in one boot, and as we sat waiting our turn to roll on the runway, there came all of a sudden a loud explosion just outside the door. We were being bombed, I thought. They knew. Directly across the hardstand, there had been an accident. The plane was on fire. Quickly we stood, shuffled to the door, and climbed to the pavement. Some waddled heavily over to extinguish the flames and remove the wounded. I helped to extract the bundles from below the plane and slide them away from the fire. It was no easy task. They were heavy, and we could hardly move. Also beneath the plane, injured men were crying out in pain. It seems one soldier had climbed out the door to relieve himself. Apparently, the movement had cracked the cap of his gammon grenade, and while re-entering, he detonated several fragmentation grenades in his pocket. Needless to say, he was blown to pieces, and 2 other soldiers were seriously wounded. It was a grievous accident and weighed heavily on our minds. We thought of it more than we did the coming jump. And when we were airborne, I was afraid to turn in my seat to peer out the window for fear of an explosion in my own pocket. "You were right, Sergeant. The grenades are dangerous," I said. He shuffled the pigeons around in his cage and never looked at me when he said, "I'm always right, soldier." I stared out the open door at the aircraft beside and below us. They bobbed like heads of walking cranes. We pitched and swayed also, and every once in a while the motors seemed to spit out a burst of energy. Some men got sick, but we had small brown bags tucked under our maillots. There were clear patches, and here the channel reflected darkly. I asked the sergeant what time it was. "Oh, 200 hours, he answered. It was the 6th of June, 1944. The red light flashed on, and we pushed ourselves to our feet for equipment check. France was below us. We couldn't do much checking, but I did make sure my snap fastener was buckled to the static line. and double-checked the string on my parachute pack, for I'd once seen a man get hung up on the tail of a plane at Fort Benning. 22, okay. 21, okay. I jerked my Griswold container as it was burying itself into my armpit. One strap was so tight it had burst the tube of stinky ointment in my pocket. It let loose a vile odor, a stench I would have to live with for the next month. "Stand to the door," the jump master cried. The plane pitched and banked and immediately sprung forward, and we tumbled into the cold blast. The jerk came fast. I hardly had time to count before I was checking my chute, and was surprised at seeing it so clearly. Below, in the distance, burned a huge fire, and directly beneath me, a tree was coming up fast. Machine gun tracers flew everywhere in bright arcs, and small explosions flashed across the ground. One line of bullets thundered by so close, I'm sure they hit my parachute, and possibly my pack, for I later found brand new underwear with bullet holes. Now the machine gun was firing at the next sortie of planes. They passed in waves, roaring like mighty falls, and at 400 feet made easy targets that were hard to miss. The moon still watched through a hole in the cloud, and I could see the trees sliding closer and closer. I climbed hard on my risers, trying to guide my parachute toward an open field. The tree slipped behind me, and in virtually no time, I slid in over a hedgerow and struck the ground. It was iron! I had never hit so hard before and fell on the reel of radio wire I was carrying. When I tumbled, I crushed the reel with my shoulder. Afraid of rushing the gammon grenades as well, I must have twisted, and I threw my shoulder out of place and maybe tore a ligament. Whatever it was, it shot pains through my body. My right arm was useless. I lay there for what seemed hours. A fluttering came from across the fence and passed over my head, but I couldn't see what it was. Birds, maybe? I tried to unsnap the hooks of my webbing, but I couldn't. I wasn't even able to unfasten my Griswold container and get my rifle. I laid there stunned, listening to the silent padding of the jump boots around me and to the garbled voices of German soldiers beyond the hedge. Crickets chirped everywhere. In my desperation, I reached for my jump knife and began hacking at the straps, keeping alert since it was still dark. In my hurry, I mistakenly cut into the straps of my pack. How confusing everything was. What seemed to be 4 figures appeared below an apple tree. They stalked toward me, crouching, and their rifles were fixed with bayonets. One carried a machine gun. They hugged the hedge and approached in the shadows. With my knife in my hand, I was determined not to get a bayonet in the stomach without revenge. They crept closer and stopped. "Are you alive?" one rasped in a stage whisper. "Help me get out of this damn thing," I cried. Within minutes, they had me free and snapped my shoulder back into place. The roll of wire hung in a tangled mess, hooked to every buckle and strap. I removed underwear, rations, poncho, toilet articles, and cigarettes from my pack. I thought I stuffed everything beneath my jacket, but somehow misplaced my poncho. I wedged socks inside the gas mask carrier. My shoulder and helmet were covered with mud. I jerked a draped parachute from the hedge and wiped the mud from my hands and face and tried to mop the vile ointment from my pocket, for it had already ruined 2 packs of cigarettes. "Carry some of this ammo," one man ordered. After slinging my M1, I removed the gammon grenade with my left hand. I was more afraid of that than I was of the Germans. Finally, I picked up the metal ammo box with my right hand. "My damn arm's killing me," I complained as I ran to catch up. At that instant, another wave of airplanes roared over. One plane was trailing a long tail of flame. We could actually feel the heat. It crashed about 1,000 feet away, and its fire took up the whole night sky. It was a terrible sight and a deafening sound. The German machine gun continued to blaze the air with bullets. "Hurry," the sergeant called. "There's a gate." We could see where the gunner was. We bent like thieves and ran. How that damn gun rattled! So quickly the planes passed. Now the gunner was aiming at the descending troopers. The gate had already been opened, as it was impossible to cross the hedges. "Listen to that," the soldier cried. "Sounds like a church bell." Probably some priest hoping for freedom, I mumbled. I slowed to see where the gun was. It had stopped firing. The whole scene was like a weird dream. One soldier constantly clicked the little metal cricket we all carried, like ones we used to get from Buster Brown's shoes when we were kids. He was hoping for a reply click. Listen, that Kraut's moaning. Shh, across the hedge, the soldier answered, pointing. Although others were yelling in the distance, we could hear a mournful cry just across the hedge. Someone was in pain. I lowered the ammo box and unscrewed the cap of my gammon grenade. Again, the soldier snapped the clicker. There was no reply, only sobs. Flash, I called, for that was the password. I waited for the countersign, thunder, but it did not come. Flash, I called again. Still there was no response. Then, for some reason, inexperience, I guess, I raised my head above the hedge. Are you hurt? I called. I'm setting his leg. There's a Kraut machine gun at the end of the hedge, by that tree. The voice returned in an exclamation of impatience. Another cold shiver gripped me. I could have killed both of them with a grenade. Again, the planes drowned out the night, and again the Germans sent up his bullets. This time I could hear screams from above. Someone was hit. Here, the soldier pointed, and we both let our gammon grenades fly. There was a quick double explosion, and the tracers quit. A shrill cry sounded for a brief second between the explosions. We did not attempt to cross the hedge, nor even to peer over, but we ran as fast as we could up the path toward a thick stand of taller trees. Another burning plane roared not 20 feet above our heads and plunged into the hedgerows, sending up a ball of orange flame that ignited the clouds. My God, it was a fearful explosion, and it shook the ground violently, spraying shrapnel over our heads. The American plane scared me, but not like the Germans did. We skirted around the back of the town, although we'd been sniped at. Now several Germans opened fire on us with their MP-40s, and each burp splattered the dirt before us, stopping just in time. The man on my right was wounded in the leg. The ricochets glanced off the trees and whined into the smoking gray stone buildings behind us. It was frightful. For a dark while, I was trapped in a culvert. As I peeked out, Hitler's terrifying dive bomber, Stuka, flew over, not 200 feet up. It was headed into the crack of daylight and thankfully never came back. Morning was breaking, along with a rush of our own aircraft again. The C-47s were now towing gliders with stubby noses and equal amounts of the larger horses, full of jeeps and other ground supplies. I was chopping a foxhole into the mud of a hedgerow when I was alerted by a low whine coming from beyond an apple tree. Before I could run, a huge horse was swooping down on me. I dove into my hole. There was a shattering of fiber, a breaking of branches as the big monster skimmed the top of my hole. 15,000 pounds, the sergeant said they weighed. It was a dreadful crashing, and I was sprayed with branches and dirt. For a moment I held my breath and cautiously raised my head. The craft had broke apart, and almost before it stopped, 2 soldiers leaped from the opening and dashed to the hedge. Soon others dragged out a field piece. They had no more cleared the area when an incoming Waco glider crashed into the side of the Horsa. 4 men flew into the air, one breaking his back. My God, he screamed. This was only one small incident. I counted close to 500 gliders before I got tired counting, and I did not see a single glider that hadn't crashed, turned over, or landed in a swamp. Before I could finish my hole, we pushed on to a river. The Doubs, I believe it was. Someone had already knocked out a German tank on the edge of the bridge. Emplacements had been hastily dug, and we flew into them before we saw 2 more tanks approaching. One trooper, writhing in agony, had been blown apart by a German 88. The other soldiers, as they passed, with that sacred act of comradeship, injected him with their own morphine until he wasn't in pain anymore. Where I crouched, I could see a bazooka team below and a field piece near the bridge. The bodies of 2 paratroopers lay on the abutment in that calm, eternal sadness we came to know so well. I found out later that they had helped to knock out the tank, however, not before the tank's machine guns got them. I was acting as assistant machine gunner. I never knew who my gunner was, but I knew he was good at his job. H Company, I think. My platoon had been scattered and unable to assemble, with all the hedges separating us. I also heard that one of our communications planes had gone down in the channel. I believed this until we came across its sad piece of wreckage. The engines of the C-47 were melted into a smoldering mass of metal. 9 reserve chutes lay welded in nylon mounds. Their hand grips had never been pulled. There were some snap fasteners on the static line, evidence that a few had left the plane. In the center of the burned fuselage lay remnants of a fragmentation hand grenade. And part of a battalion radio we needed so badly. I was sick. The field piece knocked out 2 more German tanks. The details escaped me. Everything happened so suddenly. My head was looking for its own shelter. The rounds from the 88 crashed over our hull and burst with terror. We trembled, even knowing that we were too low for them to reach. Nevertheless, the waiting was hell. Finally leaving that emplacement, I was relieved to find the sergeant from Salerno and my own company, and they were relieved to find me. The 1st Battalion was desperately short of communication men. The sergeant had found a body plowed into a hedgerow with a long trail of communication wire and an unopened parachute stretched out from it. He thought that trooper was me. As the day waned, we found refuge in a cellar. The sergeant sat on his helmet between 2 giant vats of cider. Hundreds of gallons of cider. He lit a candle, set his detective novel near it, and lit up a cigar. He told me that his cage of pigeons had burst, and all the birds had flown back to England. All but one with a broken wing. A French girl picked it up the next day. Outside, the barking of a machine gun sounded in the dark, and the rumble of a distant tank shook the ground. A strong apple odor sifted up from the damp floor. I brushed my teeth in cider, then poured it on a strip of torn parachute I was planning to use for a bed, and tried desperately to swab the stinky goo from my pocket. The sergeant offered me the crackers from his K-rations. They tasted buttery and went well with the cider. He drew deeply from the cigar and coughed lightly. "You're not planning to sleep in here with that stink on you?" What time is it?" I asked, plopping down to rest against the vat. "Oh, 200 hours, he sighed. "War is hell, but we're doing what we have to do. You'll remember these days 40 years from now." That sergeant from Salerno remains in France, beneath a small white cross. But on both counts, he was right. I remember it like he said I would. And war is hell. No one can deny that. But look around. The world is full of bells, and they continue to ring for freedom.